So, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's SecurityBoulevard.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong and Snowflake. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting presentation ahead, but first, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. First, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session. If you have any questions, we want you to send those in using the Q&A tab on the right side of the screen. It's also where you're going to find the chat tab, where we want you to engage with your fellow audience members. Let us know your thoughts throughout today's webinar. We also have a copy of the slides available for download. If you click the Handouts tab, you can feel free to download that at your own convenience. And before we close, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around till the very end. So our topic today is leveraging a cloud data platform to respond to cybersecurity events, and we'll be discussing headline event response and how security teams prepare and respond. Joining me is Omer Singer, Head of Cybersecurity Industry at Snowflake, and we have Jacob Salassi, Director of Product Security at Snowflake. Omer and Jacob, thank you so much for being here with me. I'm going to let you guys take it from here.
Thanks, Cody. Like I said, I'm Jacob. I'm the Director of Product Security at Snowflake, joined with my partner in crime here, Omer, who leads cybersecurity strategy. And we want to talk to you a little bit about headline events. Omer, you want to talk about the agenda today?
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. And thank you all for joining us today. Today, we're going to talk about, first of all, what are headline events? And we think everybody has a good sense for what incident response is. And if there is kind of a suspected breach in the organization, you got to do your incident response. But we thought that there's not enough talk about headline events. So first of all, we'll define what that even is, and then we'll help you to prepare for the next headline event. So we're going to use our experience from within Snowflake and from talking to other leaders in the industry on how can you be well prepared for the next headline event. We'll talk about the specific phases for how do you run through headline event response. And we'll have some final takeaways. We hope you find this presentation valuable. Now, Jacob, over to you. What are headline events?
Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit about it. I think the first thing to understand is that these things are becoming more frequent. And Omer, like you said, many organizations have a specific definition of what a security incident is. Usually centers around active exploitation, data breaches, and other cases where a threat actor is exploiting a vulnerability that we know about. And actually, for most companies, these things are infrequent. But these headline events, and so we've got some examples here: Log4j, SolarWinds, Okta. Well, these are becoming much more frequent, and they're challenging because they're either highly critical, widespread, or otherwise they're going to potentially impact a large portion of most companies' assets. And the thing is in years past, these events would mostly be known to security professionals, but now what we're seeing is, well, they're on the front page of media outlets, which means your executives and board members are seeing it. Maybe even your mother is seeing it. And with this visibility, many security teams find themselves responding to things that feel as critical as an incident, but are not actively being exploited. Now, this is kind of hard for both IR and product security teams because, well, it's urgent, right? So these events are often highly critical. They require your teams to drop everything that they're doing to focus on response. Well, if your teams are not structured for this could be extremely disruptive to your day-to-day activities. And in fact, you may even struggle to keep supporting your internal customers.
I think, by the way, in terms of that urgency, I mean, it definitely makes sense when you think about how interconnected companies are today, especially if you're like a B2B SaaS company, right? You have enterprises that rely on you. Maybe you hold some of their metadata or maybe actual data, right? So they're justifiably nervous if they're seeing that there's some sort of big vulnerability in the headlines or there's some big breach in the headlines. They want assurance that they're not indirectly affected. And then you have even kind of consumer-facing companies holding sensitive data from their customers. So when these things hit the headlines, there's a lot of questions being asked, right? So
that's right.
A lot of urgency there.
That's right. And it's no good that really there's a lack of processes, right? Because this is not typical IR, right? And often there are no documented processes on how to respond to these headline events. And so, like you said, you're going to do things ad hoc. You may fail to notify your customers. You might fail to recognize that that's something that they care about or other stakeholders might care about. And so, a lot of ProdSec teams, they have a steady state process of identifying vulnerabilities and helping developers patch them up. And, there can be good and bad versions of that, but largely this is routine and mundane. These teams are not used to immediate response like a typical SOC or an IR team is. They may not even be staffed 24/7. They may not even have on-call resources, right? But when the moment strikes, well, they're going to need to follow similar practices of IR teams. They're going to have to provide efficient response. And will they have any preparedness to do so? We don't think many teams do. So another thing that's a challenge here is a lack of responsibility, or rather a lack of clarity, leading to kind of a clash of responsibilities. So if it's not yet an incident or it's been declared not an incident, right, you may not be following the typical IR playbook. And an example here is as well, in the case of Log4j, we can't just wait for IR to complete their investigation before remediation begins. And this means that both teams are working in parallel. We may be stepping on each other's toes, and that activity is going to need to be coordinated. And kind of the last,
Jacob, is that by the way theoretical, or kind of as head of product security at Snowflake, did you feel that kind of yourself and your team when there was one of these big headline things happening recently?
Yeah, and we'll share some more anecdotes toward the end, but definitely Log4j was an example where we had both of these teams working feverishly together to try to address this. And there was a question of which hosts are impacted, and then remediation is going on at the same time. And if we're removing a host from scope, then we're potentially removing a host that needs to be investigated for potential abuse later. So patching the host and then also having investigated the host, like those things have to happen in a sequence. And so while I don't think it went sideways at Snowflake because we coordinated ourselves in the sense that, hey, there's a Slack channel, there was so much we could have done better and so much energy burned on inefficiencies in this coordination. And I think maybe another dimension to this is this data, right? We might not have access to the right data, right? In the sense that the IR team is much more familiar with the data they work with, and the ProdSec team is much more familiar with the data they work with. But the fact is that you need a complete and unified asset inventory. You need a provable software bill of materials that everyone can consume. And you need a unified log repository that everyone's looking at. If we're all looking in different places for indicators of abuse or vulnerability, we're going to come up with different answers. So, our take here was IR teams are suffering responding to non-incidents, and product security teams are suffering by being unprepared, to deliver this strong foundation and response. And it also means the overall response might not actually be good, could include gaps. And so the question then is well, how should IR and product security teams work together? And I think if we look at this, most teams probably followed, a set of steps that looks like this. You messaged a response team, said, hey, it's going to be something to look out for. Certainly in our case, we said, hey, Log4j, I think we all kind of knew at the same time, but, ProdSec reached out and said, hey, this is something we want to work on. We asked, the IR team, do some threat hunting, look into the systems. We asked the red team, run this code, see if things are being exposed, see if we are vulnerable in certain places. We say, okay, get the rest of the security team involved. We need to wake up our friends in CorpSec. We need to start looking at scope, and then we need to start coordinating patching, right? It sounds reasonable. But, in that case, for us and for many teams, this happens strictly by accident and kind of in informal ways. And looking back, the vast majority of security teams at major companies and, my peers in the industry described themselves as completely underwater responding to Log4j, even though they were all doing some version of these reasonable steps. Like everyone knows what response looks like, but somehow we all did it pretty poorly. And now the process is a bit disjointed because of a few things, right? Between IR and traditional ProdSec teams or AppSec teams, right? The people, process, and technology are a bit siloed, and that's going to vary depending on where you are. And IR and product security teams usually use different tech stacks and operate independently, and they might not be able to come together. And the fact is that product security teams might not be involved in every incident investigation. So this whole approach, might be somewhat new to them.
Yeah, and I've seen even to an extreme on that. I've spoken to customers where people actually lost their jobs during one of these big headline response events because some of the key data sets that they needed were in cold storage, right? So they were keeping some of the latest event data in their SIM, but a lot of data was out in archive, and it was taking them days and days to restore it, be able to look through it. And leadership was so frustrated with how long it took them to get to an understanding of how they stand and are they affected, and let's get back to the customers, that people straight up lost their jobs over it. So definitely important to solve this and to do better. Let's look at some requirements for efficient response to headline events.
Yeah. And so I think, the good news is it's mostly low-hanging fruit, right? We don't actually have to invent something brand new. And we've said it before. We just need to learn a few things from IR in order to respond to these events more intentionally. I think that's kind of the key thing. And that leads to us responding to them more quickly and effectively. So the first thing is of course, rigorously documented and executed playbooks like IR teams use for incidents, but geared toward vulnerability remediation in this case. These playbooks should specifically navigate handoff if something becomes an incident and when something is no longer an incident. If the playbook is not documented, it doesn't exist. It's not a playbook if you don't execute it. And I would argue that if it's not version controlled, backed by code and trending toward automation, it's probably not a good playbook. But a playbook is much better than no playbook. So have a playbook and make sure that you're following it. I think the second really critical thing is these relevant data sets. You need to rigorously understand your first party code, your third party dependency, their transitive dependencies. You need to understand every image and every host that it runs on. So an image inventory, VM asset inventory, and then you need a rigorous set of vulnerability data to then apply back to those assets and be able to answer this question of what is
and activity logs too, right? That could be a relevant data set if there is an issue, right? How is it abused? Kind of how are attackers taking advantage of this vulnerability if there really is that thing happening?
That's right. And in the case of Log4j, I think without specifically some of the things we mentioned, where asset exposure was huge and subtle and really quite insidious, then you end up questioning your tools, you question your data, you're trying to map between multiple clouds, vulnerability tools, and any slippage or friction, coming back to what you mentioned, Omer, creates delays, right? You need to be able to trust this data and it needs to be there all the time. And what I really want to highlight is these kind of data concerns are not typical ProdSec concerns, maybe not even product security team concerns. And I think that takes us to a specific aspect of continuous monitoring. So the first thing is okay, from this data, we better be generating and deriving structured insights from the data in the form of dashboards and alerts, right? The data's in tables, it's in dashboards, and it's in alerts, and we can query it and it's there. But we talked about trusting the data. And so I think the key thing I want to highlight here is you need insights about the data. Most importantly, that you can prove it is fresh, complete, accurate, and structured properly. And we're not going to spend enough time on this. It's very important. You need to back your data with data engineering and monitoring. And so, maybe some of these things seem obvious and trite, but, I'll encourage you to ask yourself, do you have these things? Do you have playbooks, back this code? Do you have data quality checks for that data? I don't think most security teams, and certainly we initially were not taking data quality and data engineering seriously enough. So, and kind of to that point, when I started at Snowflake, if I'm totally honest, I didn't always see the need for a data lake, particularly for AppSec. To me, it had a lot more utility as a SOC or threat hunting tool. Now, over time, folks like Omer convinced me that this approach had legs. So, Omer, why don't you tell us a little bit about why you think it's important for security teams?
So this movement towards a security data lake architecture is one that I'm very excited about, and I'm proud that Snowflake is taking a leading role in this, and we see more and more of our customers moving to a security data lake architecture where all those relevant data sets that we talked about, whether it's the inventory, whether it's the vulnerabilities, the users, or all of the activity logs themselves, are all centralized in the cloud data platform. And it's the same cloud data platform that the rest of the company uses. So you get this single source of truth. And you have these very powerful analytics that you can run on that data so that you have a path towards automation. And by having security data lake in something like Snowflake, you get the instant scalability where, okay, there's a headline event now, and you're getting asked tough questions. And by the way, it might go back, 6 months, 12 months, even 18 months, like we saw in the case of Sunburst, right? The SolarWinds breach. I mean, that was going on for over a year before anybody had any clue that there's actually an issue there. And so being able to confidently answer, oh, we are not affected by this, requires going back a year or more. And that's something that a cloud data platform can enable by having inexpensive storage that never runs out. You're not limited to any kind of retention window that's imposed by the vendor. You can really set it yourself. And just having the data is not enough. I see teams that might just rely on cloud buckets for holding onto the data. That might solve the storage aspect of it, but what you don't get is the scalability of asking actual relevant questions to that data and getting answers back quickly. So with a modern cloud data platform as a security data lake, you can scale way up the compute power, right? Get answers to the questions, be able to close out that headline event, and then scale it back down so that you're not breaking the bank. And that's the separation of compute from storage. And it's been really transformative for security teams that I work with that have adopted the security data lake. And you're right, Jacob, it has started in the area of threat detection and response. SOC's really looking for a way to do better than what traditional SIM solutions are able to give them. But now, things like headline events, for example, are driving additional use cases. And we have this ecosystem of connected applications coming up where you have these warehouse native connected apps, which are cybersecurity solutions that say you as the customer get to own the data. And you can choose where it lives, and you can kind of bring your data platform. So the work comes to the data rather than the other way around. And what that means is actually setting up a security data lake is much faster and easier than it ever was. It's now like installing an app on your iPhone. You just kind of deploy it and it's there. And that has the integrations to pull in asset inventory from different clouds, or pull in vulnerabilities from your vulnerability scanners, bring in these different data sets, have content that, for example, normalizes them or enriches them with user and asset details. All these capabilities are off the shelf. And that's a big benefit to the connected application aspect of using your cloud data platform as a security data lake. And one of the things that I hear as a concern is like, can we have a security data lake? Sure, all these benefits sound great, but do we have the resources internally as a incident response team or as a product security team to actually use a security data lake? Well, the modern cloud data platform is fully managed and has multi-cloud support. So there really isn't a lot of overhead. There's virtually no management that goes into maintaining this. So it's much more accessible than ever. It really changes what you can bring to bear when you're preparing to respond to headline response. So we think it kind of goes really nicely with the theme that we're talking about today.
Right.
And do put, by the way, questions in the Q&A. I know we're covering a lot. A lot of this is probably new to many people here in the audience. So anybody does have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll respond at the end.
It's like you mentioned, Omer, the asset inventory and the data lake, this has been, I don't want to overuse the word transformative, really clutch for me as an AppSec leader, right? A ProdSec leader. Now I have reliable asset inventory. I have this reliable vulnerability data. And slowly we've started to think about what are the other things we can store in here. Store threat model data here, right? We get actually a lot of value out of storing structured data about what developers are doing and what they're building, and being able to come back and query that data and construct models about what they've built. So actually there's quite a bit more that teams can be doing with what you said, these kind of primitives of large, cheap storage and data aggregation. I just don't think AppSec teams and ProdSec teams think a lot about this. Why don't we talk a little bit about the phases of headline response? And I think now maybe we can go all the way back. Omer, you said this at the beginning. Jacob, what exactly is a headline event? So, before we can declare it, we got to know, right? How do we define a headline event? And I think the key question here is who is responsible for consistently identifying headline events and alerting on new ones? So at Snowflake, we take this approach. Our definition evaluates 3 axes: severity, impact, and ease of exploitation. I don't think that's really revolutionary. If it scores high on 2 of them, we would consider it to be a candidate. And what we see is that media coverage typically mirrors this same evaluation. But it's kind of interesting to note that media coverage is not always aligned. And sometimes it hypes up events and vulnerabilities that will not fit or are even completely irrelevant for customers that use a modern tech stack. But there's still, even if what that means is that the impact analysis might be immediate for you. Oh, it's a no op for us, right? We don't use that. But still, and we talked about this earlier, there is a communication piece to respond to customer inquiries and proactively update company leadership. You don't know.
Exactly. Because you can't tell customers or the board that don't worry about this, guys. This is for a different kind of tech stack. This doesn't affect us. Don't worry. You can't tell them that before you've actually worked through a certain process. And if they're concerned, that's all really it takes to kind of justify the team looking into it.
And in my experience, Omer, that you can't even tell them that at all. You can't just tell them, guys, don't worry about it, right? Yeah. You actually need to have a rational technical explanation. And what I find is that executives, to a degree, want to consume that. They want to understand what are the details about this and how are we not impacted, because they're hearing from their friends in the industry, their peers in the industry about it. And they're discussing how each other's companies are responding. So like, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of people discussing this. And I think it's important that, you're informed and that you don't just send messages out.
So just to be clear, in terms of what we're considering a headline event, it doesn't require an attacker to actually have gone in and targeted any system?
No.
Right. Just by what's in the headlines.
That's right. We're just looking to see, is it a high severity event that impacts a lot of businesses while we're responding? Is it maybe a low severity event that's very easy to exploit? We may be responding. And certainly if it's in the headlines, we're going to respond. I think what we don't want to say is that the headlines necessarily dictate it. What we say is there's an evaluation. But I think what's important is to say that, one, we find that this mirrors what people are putting out there. And then two, this is kind of like, you need to scale this up, because headlines show up in different places. And so you need to approach this, we think, as a threat intelligence problem, right? You need a TI team who's going to be monitoring these events, and they're really in a good position to do this already. They can monitor large numbers of news feeds, and they can bring in additional feeds, more highly curated, exploitability, for example, threat actors launching campaigns, for example, right, to kind of enrich what we do. And I think there could be cases where we may even choose to respond to things that are not quite in the news, but are well known in the industry. But I think the point here is that if no one feels like it's their responsibility to monitor for this type of event, then you're not going to get timely alerts, and different people are going to apply different standards, and you're going to have a really inconsistent experience. So our recommendation is to clearly define an owner, and for us, it's threat intelligence. And the role doesn't stop there for threat intelligence, right? They need to continue to provide a constant feed of updates as they become available. So if we think about Log4j, the constant updates on what versions were exploitable, the updates about how payloads evolved over time to exploit it, right? We needed all of that information, and everyone here who responded to it knows you responded 3 or 4 times actually to Log4j. The other thing is it doesn't end with them. Because, right, we have been operating in this sort of gray area where lots of people actually get signals on what these events are. And I think what's important here is that any individual or team can find something that worries them on Twitter and the news, and they can raise the alarm. But the owner, the threat intelligence team for us, should have a published intake mechanism, right? So people need to be aware that here is where you can come to express these concerns and get a timely response. And you might think, well, this is a lot like security incident. Many teams have a security email address where people can email these things. It's important to communicate that there's a place that people can send these kinds of concerns, because your users have them, your peers and your coworkers have them. We get asked these questions all the time. Another thing is coordination using playbooks, right? So for us, we have a structured Google Doc, and it sort of prescribes a Slack channel of a standard naming convention, and we kind of use this. We spin up war rooms when they're needed to support investigations. So if ProdSec needs to support IR to answer questions about, was this exploited or not, they need that domain expertise. And then conversely, if IR is out of the picture and ProdSec is coordinating, for example, massive developer response to patch Log4j, these are all activities where you're going to need to coordinate, and who is the owner, right? I think that's the important thing we're trying to point out here. So keep in mind, you as a product security team also need to be in a position to coordinate comms with field teams, understand customer concerns, and communicate updates. So you've heard that you need to listen to your customer. Like, how are you going to do that? How are you physically going to get those concerns from your customer, and how are you physically going to deploy the response to the field, right? I think these are some important things to consider here. Omer, why don't you talk a little bit about the phases overall?
Yes, great. So I think we've now established that headline events are happening. They need to be handled, and if they're not handled well, they can cause burnout within the security organization and frustration outside with leadership and with customers. So let's prepare, and let's have a good understanding of what this response should ideally look like, in seeing kind of how we've responded in the past and what works well, and speaking to others. We kind of break down headline event response to 4 phases. In the first phase, we do identification and scoping, which means we want to understand that, yes, there is a headline event. Okay, we got to get together and we got to address it. And we need to understand what is in scope, meaning what might be affected. So if we have, for example, a vulnerability around RDP, and it's being actively exploited, and the headlines are yelling about this is a big deal. Everybody needs to kind of make sure they're not affected. Well, we want to understand what is the scope for us, right? Which servers are running RDP, for example, right? So that might be in the scoping. And then once the scope is clear for this headline event, we want to understand the impact to us, to the systems. And that's in the impact analysis phase, and that's where there's a lot of collaboration between ProdSec and incident response. And having understood the impact, then we move into remediation and monitoring, right? Let's fix it and make sure that it stays fixed, whether it's patching that needs to be applied or whether it's mitigating any kind of breach situation. That's remediation and monitoring. And finally, communications, both within the security team, but very importantly, out to the stakeholders, to leadership, and to customers, so everybody has a clear sense of what happened, what is the impact, and that we have a good handle on this as a security team, right? Creating that confidence, that's in the communication phase and where we have time to shine. And just wanted to call out that as you're thinking about these different phases, it's important to think about how the data platform that you're using can support you. Because again, that having the data, being able to ask the questions of that data, so important, right? Being able to easily access it in one place rather than when you're running through these phases, go into dozens of different sources. That's really going to make a difference for the security team. Being able to quickly query so that there's not any kind of lag or delay introduced in getting answers, and being flexible in the kind of questions you want to ask. So as you understand more about kind of the developing situation with the vulnerability or with the incident, with the attack campaign, etc., you can combine different data sets and get to that kind of accurate picture of what's going on, and then everybody being on the same page through live dashboards. That's really going to help to stay coordinated as the team moves through these 4 phases of headline event response.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the first bit, identification, scoping, and impact analysis. And so, we're talking about internal assets, but also third parties to understand impact on our supply chain. So the thing is here is no single tool is going to cover everything. At Snowflake, we're getting signals from multiple places for Log4j. So we've got host-based scanners, we've got native container image scanners across 3 clouds, on hundreds of accounts. We've got cloud security posture management tools kind of deployed at the same scale. And what this highlights is the importance of that centralized asset inventory. And it's got to be something that sort of transcends, aggregates, and deduplicates all of these tools. That means you have a data model for your assets, and you're able to aggregate them, you're able to deduplicate them, and have a singular view into all of your assets. I think this is really important. We also, your internal assets, that's great. We've also got to be able to track third-party risk from vendors. So this is another critical set of assets that you can't overlook when you think about the asset inventory problem. So I think there's kind of a series of questions that you need to be able to answer with a high degree of confidence. Where is the software used? Is that particular software vulnerable, and what happens if it's exploited? And similarly, where is that vendor used? Is that vendor vulnerable, and what happens if that vendor is exploited? These are kind of some of the things we think about from a scoping and impact analysis perspective from the ProdSec side. But Omer, maybe you can talk a little bit about what IR teams are kind of thinking about here.
Yeah, happy to. And by the way, I think it's cool that we're even naming this persona of a ProdSec responder, right? I think many security teams haven't even thought along those terms, and the product security a lot of the time works on these kind of very organized projects, and they have their roadmaps and they have Jira tickets, very organized, which is great, especially given how AppSec is close to the developers, etc. But starting to think of themselves or having individuals that are kind of ready to be scrambled and kind of come to help in a situation where they are the ProdSec responder. That already, I think, is a big shift that needs to happen and is going to enable better response. But yeah, the incident response team is usually involved. They're usually thinking, okay, if there's an attacker in the network, we gotta mitigate that, and we gotta minimize the impact, and we gotta establish that we're back in control of our systems. Here, it's a little bit different, right? You're trying to prove that you were not affected, but you want to use the skills and the tools that have been built in the traditional IR capacity, and also adjacent capabilities and skills and tools in areas like red team, right? So understanding what might this attack look like, going through what's been published, going through threat intelligence, and understanding, okay, this is the payload, this is what it kind of requires for the exploit to be successful. That's going to affect what's in scope. So understanding the attack, that's the red team and the IR team, and then going through all the logs in the security data lake or wherever you're keeping the activity, and making sure that based on what we understand from the in-scope systems, and based on what we understand for what kind of attacks targeting this vulnerability or attacks as part of this campaign, are there any signs of related activity in our environment? Because this is one of the big questions that everybody's going to be asking is, have we been affected? And the IR team is in a good position to answer that question. But you can see here that this doesn't all fall on them. And this is important because we did see in the past frustration from the IR team when they feel like, why is this all falling on us? We don't think that there's an attacker in the network, and here we are doing all this work. I think having very clearly defined roles and responsibilities helps to make this go smooth and not to burn out your IR team on these frequent headline events.
Yeah, that's right. So let's talk then a little bit about remediation and monitoring. I think the most important thing, for remediation and monitoring is the data. And going back to what I said before about the data quality, you either have the data that allows you to make these green check boxes, or you don't. And you can either trust the data that you use to check these boxes, or you can't. And my advice to everyone here is decide one way or the other. If there's any doubt, then accept it. Accept that you don't have complete coverage, and then behave that way, right? Also make it a priority to quantify the level of coverage you have and characterize what's missing. It's not a mistake to have a partial inventory. It's a mistake to have it and not know it. And so the second thing I'll say is that monitoring your tools is great, but you also have to take an adversary mindset. You have to monitor your attackable external surface as if you were an adversary scanning for vulnerabilities, and you've got to include that data in your analysis. And really, this comes back to that partial inventory. This is exactly the kind of defense in depth thing I would recommend you do if you can't completely trust your inventory. And really, I'd advise you to take that approach even if you can. But beyond that, kind of seeing the things that are on the slide, we're not really saying anything groundbreaking, right? You want to fix it. You want to make sure it doesn't come back. And that has to happen, on a continuous basis. You can't just patch and forget it, right? Production environments are complex and volatile, and you may find out that vulnerabilities are being reintroduced somewhere in the environment after you're patching them. So I think it's just important to take that continuous approach here. And this, to me, from my experience here, is actually where playbooks are going to help you the most, because communication is the thing that is easiest to get wrong. I think selecting the stakeholders to communicate to, really, that's just one problem. It's the substance of your communication that's much more important and can lead to much more kind of insidious problems. So it's important to work with your legal team to craft language that is supported by data. Let me give you an example. Not impacted. Does this mean exploitable but not exploited? Not exploitable at all? Your customers are going to ask this. Your stakeholders are going to ask this, and they're going to interpret what you say differently if you're not specific. And you may create liability for yourself that doesn't exist. And so I think it's very important to work with your legal team on the language before you release it to your customers and stakeholders, so that you're being accurate about what's happened. Do not make these communications up on the fly. And I think that the real thing here is don't let that sense of urgency rush you into a confusing update that leads to more questions and concerns. And that's something that's happened to us. Do have a list of stakeholders defined in your playbook for headline events, and do have templated communications that are peer reviewed by legal, security leadership, customer support, customer account teams, and sales teams if needed, kind of depending on how your customer account structures are set up. But you need that support, security, legal, and these customer facing sales teams. And
ideally, if you are, for example, in a B2B business, understanding for each of you kind of customer who at the business you need to contact.
That's right. The security contact is absolutely critical. That's right. And then I think the thing is here is use those templates and update them every single time, right? You will find yourself finding a reason not to. That's kind of the problem. The last thing I'll highlight here is automate your communication. I don't think this was something that was so obvious to us, but as we made this decision to use threat intelligence to coordinate, what we said was, well, we actually don't think there should be so much coordination here. Like, actually, ProdSec teams know how to handle patching. And what's at issue here is coordination and producing unified comms out to the various stakeholders about this highly coordinated activity. So we said, well, it shouldn't be this hard then. Like, we're not going to go hire someone whose job it is to just sit and like make sure that happens. Like, our processes should result in that. Like, a side effect of us, doing our work in Jira should be that we produce updates automatically. So I think, your playbook should guide your teams to provide structured updates to your work items. Those, in the case of us, aggregated in a data lake, all of our Jira data is there, right? We can automatically aggregate what's there. We can convert that into external communications. And like I said,
and across the board, right? So if we're talking about, for example, patching and remediation, having the status of remediation be available in self-service dashboards that are powered by the live data. If you have that going, you have in effect automated much of the communication, right? And the team can take a step back from the status updates and work on actually getting this thing closed out faster.
And that's such a key point. And the one thing we wanted to say is, how do we get these teams out of providing these status updates, right? It's changing minute by minute. Like, we can't just do this. We need to make it transparent. And that's where we said, well, let's have this be a dashboard, and let's have this understand who these stakeholders are, and let's have it speak to them, right? So they can go to a place and self-service. Now, I'm not going to tell you that this eliminates executives or board members beating down your door and asking questions, but you can point them to the same place every single time. And I think that's important, is to say, here is where we communicate about this, and either hold their hand and take them there or redirect them, but be very consistent. So Omer, why don't we talk a little bit about what a good example of communications look like?
I think it's instructive to look at the Cloudflare response to the Okta breach, because clearly these guys have thought about this, they have a worked out process, and they came prepared. And I think they did receive a bunch of kudos from their customer community in how they investigated the 2022 Okta compromise. And we have the link in here. So as you're thinking about this in terms of a template, I do recommend checking this out. And you'll see that, first of all, there's clear ownership, right? And we talk a lot about who's responsible for what, finding those roles and responsibilities in advance, which I'll say pretty confidently most security teams haven't done that. But here it's clear who is kind of authoring this communication. And that's a great start. Now, customers that are reading about this headline, they're probably freaking out. They want a TLDR. They want a summary at the very top. And you can see that they're kind of one paragraph of, here's kind of what we know, and here's what you need to know as a customer. So that's that quick TLDR. But then you can see that they go into details on the investigation and actions. And so if you've followed through a process and you've gone through those 4 phases that we talked about, you will have an investigation and actions that you're proud to talk about. You can go through the response process and how you approached it. Hopefully you weren't scrambling around and kind of having all these difficulties because you prepared. And so you have this response process that you can provide as an overview, and the detailed timeline that you've established. So this means kind of you've understood exactly what happened from when the incident, if it exists, if it did happen, or from when the vulnerability was introduced, etc., from that very beginning until this headline event was totally mitigated and closed out. What happened? And by showing that detailed timeline, you're giving confidence to the people reading this that, okay, Here is a security team that's on top of it, that really did a thorough job. And when they say that no further action is needed, I can believe them. All right. Otherwise, your customers will be like, okay, what do we need to do? And they might kind of doubt whether your response is justified. There's a scope and impact summary. And I think this speaks straight to the phases that we talked about, right? What was in scope, what was impacted, summarizing that as part of the report should be easy, because that's how you've kind of gone through the investigation, through the response internally as well. And then finally providing that customer guidance, because maybe there is something that they can do just to be on the safe side. And maybe you've kind of, as you've gone through your investigation, you want to give them some tools to do a similar kind of investigation, so they have peace of mind, because maybe they have some things to look for in their event logs, or maybe there's some configuration changes that they can make to be extra locked down in light of what happened. So that customer guidance is important, and conclusion and next steps, right? Making it clear that here's the all clear. Though you may be reporting throughout, you really should have this kind of final statement coming out as a response to the headline event, with a conclusion, making it clear that it's concluded, and next steps, so that your customers might be better prepared for the next time. Because if we know one thing for certain, is that these headline events will continue to happen, and then we can be real about that in the communication with customers. So I thought this was a great response, and you can find it online and prepare as well. And do share what you come up with. I think we're going to see a lot more best practices and content coming out around headline events, because of how much time they take up for the security team, and how important it is to get right in terms of kind of customer confidence and all the assurance that everybody needs if they're going to be using our systems.
And I want to just point out, go back to the TLDR. This is really important. I think for these kinds of things, it's really obvious, but other examples are kind of red team reports and other reports that security teams produce. We have a tendency to kind of bury the lead. Most people want to know. They get worried. If you get them worried, like, they want to know quickly, how worried do I need to be? And it's okay to tell them up front, like, here's what we did. So we often present, here's the problem, here's what we did, and then the details. And I think that's been a really key insight over my time to kind of manage expectations and give people what they want. Maybe we can talk about some final takeaways. And I know, Omer, you've got some thoughts on this. So maybe you can start with your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So hopefully this presentation was helpful, and first starting to think about headline events as something that's worth having an opinion on, and having some kind of process around it, means that when the next one happens, right? Again, it's not if, it's when, and it's probably going to be soon. The way things are in cybersecurity today, everybody knows what they need to be doing, and you can get back to the people that are worried about it faster, and not burn out the security team members that you rely on, both on the ProdSec side and within the SOC. Also, I think we can see throughout this conversation and throughout the phases of the headline response that data is more important than ever. And so having that security data lake, where you know that you have a single source of truth, and whatever record or data point might be relevant to the headline event response, it's ready there, and it's waiting for your team to use it as part of the general effort. That is super important. And customers that have it are sharing with us that they are more successful for having centralized their inventory and their identity and logs. So this is very encouraging, and it's something that we definitely recommend to see as part of how you prepare for the next headline event. Playbooks are very common in incident response, but here's this thing that requires response even when it's not really an incident. Let's then adapt. Don't start from scratch. Let's adapt what IR has been using for that kind of doomsday event, the breaches, the compromises, to these more mundane but frequent and very important headline event responses, and keep them up to date. Every time that we go through one of these headline events, we learn more about how we can be more effective and how we can turn these around even faster. So do be thinking about this as a live document that you're constantly adapting and updating. And like Jacob said, ideally, it's not just a document, but it's also backed by code, right? Whether it's detection as code, whether it's the expectations of the environment so that if you're not getting your asset inventory, or if there's visibility gaps, or there's a disruption in the log collection, that gets surfaced before the headline event. I think that's all part of the playbooks and preparing for communication. This is not something that you can just do within the security team. This is together with all the relevant departments that have a role to play in communication. Go through this process, prepare for the internal communication and the external communication, so that when the event happens, you have all these templates and they're really ready to go. You just fill them in with the details from the event response. How's that, Jacob? Is that kind of some good tips? Anything you want to add to that?
I think so. Well, I guess if there's anything else I want to add, it's kind of like specifically what happened to us that led us to start to have some of these ideas about response, about headline response. And so what I'll say is, like most people, we were initially unprepared for the size of the Log4j response, right? We had a good list of things that needed to be fixed, but like the number of people impacted was huge. And this was much bigger than bugs we routinely dealt with. And I think a key thing you just mentioned is, well, we thought this was an IR activity. To us in ProdSec, it looked like an incident. And we thought they knew how to coordinate those. But to them, as soon as they had proved exploitation hadn't happened and that they had monitoring in place, it wasn't an incident, right? And they pushed back and we fought it. And we asked them to be involved because we argued they had incident management experience and they knew how to do things like setting up Slack channels and setting up a shared status doc and running comms and 24/7 staffing. But I think the realization that I came away with was this was us experiencing an emotional response to our own lack of preparedness for an issue that we obviously needed to own. Like, what do you mean you know how to set up a Slack channel? Like, is that a PhD level skill right there? No, you can write that down. So I think this burnout thing, we really had to accept that, like, okay, this is our responsibility. And so then, rationally, it makes no sense to burn your IR team coordinating server patching. This is something that ProdSec teams should be good at. Like, that is an extension of a core functionality that we already provide, but now you need to provide it in an emergency, and you need to have thought about that. So, okay, let's create and use playbooks, and let's learn from IR, and let's not burn those resources out. Another kind of embarrassing thing was that the IR team, because they had done this so often, that they knew our contact list on-call rotations even better than we did, right? In some cases. And so we had to kind of sit with that and knew that IR knew how to contact our teams better than we did, and in some ways run our own resources better than we did, because we weren't exercised in incidents, right? But we knew that that's something we had to do, and it couldn't be an afterthought. And so anyway, I guess if there's like one thing overall, and this is like, advice I've received from successful people, world champion, whatever. It's simple. Like, have a plan and be ready to change it. Like, that's it. And the problem with that is, like, it's so simple. And like, that's the difference, I guess, between like world champions and everyone else, is like, you either do it or you don't. But right, have a plan and be ready to change it. Most people don't have a plan at all. So it's about intention, and it's about doing it on purpose. And I think I said a couple of times in these slides, like, we're not proposing anything groundbreaking, except perhaps what you said, Omer, is that ProdSec response is a thing. And like, as soon as you acknowledge that's a thing, then you're going to like approach it in an intentional way. And I think it's the unintentional approach that many teams are taking that are holding them back. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, great. It's a super important topic. And before we wrap, we'll answer questions that are here in the Q&A. One is around security data lake, and how that's an architecture that most security teams don't have today. And I did mention that it's easier with Snowflake than it has been in the past. And anybody that's been in this cybersecurity industry for long enough knows that there have been attempts in the past to use big data technologies like Hadoop for the security program, and they weren't as successful as people had hoped. What is different now? And then how can we ingest data into Snowflake? So what's different, I would say, with Snowflake is how it's delivered as a service. So the security team has so much that they need to do. Oftentimes, for most security teams, they can't take on deploying and managing a data platform if it's going to have any kind of overhead to keep up and to expand, etc. And then Snowflake, near zero management. There's really nothing that you need to do, and you can start with a small use case. Could be just, hey, here's couple gigabytes of vulnerability scanner output from the servers and from the containers, and we want to centralize that. All the way up to petabytes, where you have all the VPC flow logs, right, from all your cloud environments, et cetera, and have those all centralized. So it's really the same experience throughout all of that. And Snowflake makes it really easy for having that. It's also easy to pull data in. We have managed ingest service called Snowpipe, where you can just point it at a bucket and we'll stream in the data. And so again, very, very automated, very kind of high degree of management. And if your business uses Snowflake for other use cases in other departments, it's going to be very straightforward for you to get access. You can have a governed kind of separate environment for the security team. You can even have a dedicated account within the organization just for security, and still you'll be able to benefit from all the existing investment in the Snowflake that the organization has made. And you'll be able to partner with a data team if you want to use things like the ETL solution or the BI solution, right? We talked about dashboarding and how wouldn't it be great to have a Tableau dashboard, Power BI dashboard, or even the Snowsight, the built-in BI capability to reflect on how we're doing in the different areas that we're tracking as part of the response. And then finally, Snowflake also has a very extensive ecosystem of connected application solutions that have all the integrations. If you need to pull in data from the scanners and from the infrastructure and from everywhere, you don't need to build those API integrations yourself. They're available from solutions that you can quickly deploy on your Snowflake, like an app on an iPhone. And they bring the integrations, they bring the content, the normalization, the enrichment, and they have many of the dashboards as well off the shelf. So it is easy to get started with a security data lake in Snowflake, and could be a great kind of first step in getting ready to respond to cybersecurity headline events. So with that, thank you very much for joining us today. And Jacob, especially thank you to you, man, for joining here and sharing from your personal experience. Such an important topic, and I'm glad that we're starting to develop some best practices around it.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Omer.
Awesome. Well, Omer and Jacob, thank you both for joining us today. I'd like to quickly remind our audience that this session was recorded. So following this webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You can also find it living on the Security Boulevard website at securityboulevard.com/webinars. And just be sure to look in the on-demand section. So we do have 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to give away. The first winner is Curai G. Our second winner is Craig H. Our third winner is Rodell M. And our fourth and final winner is Marco M. So to the 4 of you, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. So Omer and Jacob, thank you so much for being here with us. Is there any final parting thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with before we officially close out?
No, thank you so much. And if anybody wants to kind of talk about this and share how they're doing it, learn from others, reach out. We think this is a movement and we'd love to stay in touch.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. I'd also like to thank Snowflake for sponsoring today's webinar. And officially, before we close, I would love to thank our audience. Thank you for being here with us today for the entirety of this presentation. Please just take one extra moment to fill out a brief post-webinar survey that'll pop up on your screen here in just a moment. But otherwise, we hope to see you at an upcoming Techstrong Learning webinar or workshop. Everyone, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.